Do you remember July 13th, 1985? If you were alive that day, you absolutely remember it. The entire world was glued to their television sets. Live Aid, history's biggest concert to help fight famine in Africa. Phil Collins flew across the Atlantic on a Concorde, performing both in London and Philadelphia on the same day. Status Quo opened the show. U2 made history, but everyone was waiting for one thing: Queen. And Freddie Mercury became a legend that day. 20 minutes, 72,000 people in the palm of his hand. You watched it too, didn't you? Maybe at home, maybe at a bar, maybe with friends. You shouted along during the AO part. But nobody saw it, that moment with Bowie just before he walked on stage. Brian May saw it, and he kept it secret for 40 years. Now he felt he owed it to everyone who remembered that day. He told the truth, and that truth was a story that 1.9 billion people who watched Live Aid never knew. Before we dive deeper into this untold story, if you're fascinated by the secrets behind rock's greatest moments, please subscribe to our channel. We uncover the truth behind the legends you thought you knew. The relationship between David Bowie and Freddie Mercury was never simple. It was layered with admiration, rivalry, respect, and perhaps a touch of jealousy. The kind that only exists between two artists who know they're operating at the same stratospheric level. They first crossed paths in the early 70s when Queen was still clawing their way up and Bowie was already Ziggy Stardust, the alien rock god who'd redefined what a performer could be. Freddie watched Bowie with the intensity of a student studying a master, but he was no mere imitator. He was building his own empire, his own mythology, and he knew that one day he'd stand on the same mountaintop. By 1981, that day had arrived. Queen had conquered the world with Bohemian Rhapsody, and Bowie had survived his cocaine nightmare in Los Angeles, reinvented himself in Berlin, and was riding high on the commercial success of Let's Dance. When they finally came together in the studio, it should have been magic from the first moment. Instead, it was a clash of titans that nearly destroyed what would become one of rock's most iconic collaborations. The recording sessions for Under Pressure at Mountain Studios in Montreux, Switzerland, were tense from the beginning. Both men were used to being the unquestioned creative force in the room, the one whose vision shaped the final product. Bowie had just come off producing Iggy Pop's albums and orchestrating his own creative rebirth. Freddie was riding the wave of Queen's dominance, a band that had perfected the art of layered harmonies and operatic bombast. When you put two alpha creative minds in a recording studio, both accustomed to total control, the air becomes electric, and not always in a good way. Roger Taylor, Queen's drummer, later described the atmosphere as volatile. John Deacon had come up with that iconic bass line, the one that would become instantly recognizable to generations, and everyone knew they had something special. But the question was, whose vision would dominate? Bowie wanted to strip it down, make it raw and immediate. Freddie wanted to build it up, layer it with complexity and drama. They argued over lyrics, over arrangement, over the smallest details. At one point, Bowie actually walked out of the studio. Freddie threw his hands up in frustration. Brian May sat in the corner, quietly playing his guitar, watching two geniuses battle for supremacy. But somehow, miraculously, they found a middle ground. The song that emerged was neither pure Bowie nor pure Queen. It was something entirely new, a fusion that showcased both their strengths. Bowie's raw emotional directness merged with Freddie's theatrical power. When you listen to Under Pressure, you can hear them trading lines, their voices intertwining, competing, complementing. It's a conversation in song form, and like many intense conversations, it left some wounds. After the recording finished, there was a coolness between them. Not hatred, they respected each other too much for that, but a distance. They'd created something magnificent, but the process had been bruising. In interviews afterward, both were diplomatic, praising each other's talent. But those who were there knew the truth. These were two men who'd pushed each other to the limit and weren't entirely sure they wanted to do it again. Between 1981 and 1985, Bowie and Freddie's paths diverged. Bowie spent those years riding the commercial wave of "Let's Dance," while simultaneously growing uncomfortable with the mainstream pop star he'd become. He'd sold 10 million copies, but old fans accused him of selling out, and he couldn't entirely disagree. He was making music that wasn't challenging him, playing stadiums to audiences who wanted hits, not innovation. The man who'd built his career on constant reinvention was starting to feel trapped by his own success. Freddie and Queen, meanwhile, were at a complicated crossroads. They'd released Hot Space in 1982, an album that experimented with funk and dance music, a commercial disappointment that earned them critical scorn. Then came The Works in 1984, which brought them back to rock territory with Radio Gaga and I Want to Break Free. But there was a sense that Queen's imperial phase was behind them, that they were legends but perhaps past their peak. In America especially, MTV had initially banned the I Want to Break Free video because of its drag imagery, and the band was struggling to maintain their foothold in the market that had once worshipped them. Both Bowie and Freddie were facing the same existential question that haunts every artist who's reached the top. What comes next? When you've already changed music, already sold millions, already played to hundreds of thousands, where do you find meaning? And, perhaps more importantly, how do you prove you're still relevant when a new generation is rising with their own heroes? But something else was happening in those years, something darker that nobody was talking about publicly. AIDS was killing people. The disease had first been identified in 1981, the same year Bowie and Freddie recorded Under Pressure. By 1985, it had become a pandemic in the gay community, but mainstream society was barely acknowledging it. Rock Hudson had just died months before Live Aid, finally forcing the American public to confront the crisis. But there was still massive stigma, still fear, still silence. Freddie Mercury was bisexual, a fact he never publicly confirmed but never really denied either. He moved through both straight and gay worlds with a kind of regal confidence that defied categorization. But privately, among close friends, there were worries. The whispers had started. Certain people in the industry knew things. Brian May noticed that Freddie seemed different in early 1985, more intense, more determined to prove something, as if he knew time was more precious than anyone realized. Bowie had his own relationship with sexuality and identity. He'd declared himself bisexual in 1972, then later claimed it was the biggest mistake he ever made, then later still suggested he wasn't being entirely honest when he recanted. The truth was complicated, messy, human. But by 1985, he was married to Iman and had found a kind of peace with himself that had eluded him during his cocaine years. He'd stared into the abyss and survived. He knew what it meant to lose yourself and fight your way back. July 13th, 1985, Wembley Stadium. The morning was chaos. Organized chaos, but chaos nonetheless. Bob Geldof was running on fumes and fury, having orchestrated the impossible, getting the biggest names in music to perform for free, with all proceeds going to Ethiopian famine relief. The logistics were insane, coordinating performances across 2 continents, managing egos, keeping to a brutal schedule where every minute mattered, because the whole world was watching. Bowie arrived early, before most of the crowd had filled the stadium. He'd agreed to perform a short set. TVC 15, Rebel Rebel, Modern Love, and closing with Heroes. That final choice was significant. Heroes had become more than just a song. It was an anthem of defiance and hope, written in Berlin when Bowie was clawing his way out of his darkest period. To perform it at Live Aid, an event about helping others, felt right. It felt like full circle. He was nervous, which surprised him. David Bowie didn't get nervous anymore. He'd performed for millions, had been the world's biggest star multiple times over. But there was something about this day, this event, that felt different. It wasn't about him. It was bigger than any individual performer, and that added weight. He wanted to get it right. Freddie and Queen weren't scheduled until later. Their slot was at 6:41 p.m., the prime time spot. They'd rehearsed meticulously at Shaw Theatre days before, timing every second of their 20-minute set. 20 minutes to remind the world who Queen was. 20 minutes to reclaim their throne. Freddie had been focused during rehearsals with an intensity that his bandmates noticed. This wasn't just another performance. This was a statement. Throughout the day, as other acts performed, Status Quo, the Style Council, the Boomtown Rats, Adam Ant, Ultravox, Spandau Ballet. Bowie moved through the backstage area like a ghost. He watched performances on monitors, smoked cigarettes, talked quietly with his band. He saw Paul McCartney, Elton John, The Who. It was like a rock and roll family reunion, except everyone was on edge, riding adrenaline and the weight of what they were all doing. When Bowie finally took the stage around 7 p.m., something happened. The performance was good, professional, tight, exactly what you'd expect from an artist of his caliber. But during Heroes, something shifted. Maybe it was the crowd, 72,000 people singing along to a song about lovers meeting at the Berlin Wall, about grabbing victory from the jaws of defeat. Maybe it was the knowledge that millions were watching worldwide. But Bowie felt it, that transcendent moment when performance becomes something more, when it connects to something larger than entertainment. He came off stage feeling genuinely moved, which was rare for him. He'd learned long ago to keep a professional distance, to not get too emotionally invested in any single performance. But this one had touched something. The production assistants were already rushing him along. The schedule was tight, Queen was up soon, every second counted. Bowie was supposed to head to his dressing room, maybe watch the rest from there. But he didn't. Instead, he lingered backstage. The backstage corridors of Wembley Stadium that day were narrow, crowded with equipment, cables, crew members rushing back and forth with the controlled panic that comes with live television. Bowie had just handed off his microphone to a sound technician when he saw them, Queen, walking toward the stage area. They were scheduled to go on in less than 10 minutes. Freddie was in the middle, flanked by Brian May, Roger Taylor, and John Deacon. They were already in performance mode, that focused energy that comes right before you step into the spotlight. Brian May saw Bowie first. He was carrying his red special guitar, the one he'd built with his father as a teenager, the instrument that had become an extension of himself. May smiled, nodded. Then Freddie spotted Bowie, and his expression changed. It wasn't cold, these weren't enemies, but it wasn't warm either. It was complicated. 4 years since Under Pressure. 4 years since those intense, difficult studio sessions. They'd spoken occasionally since then, been polite at industry events. But the distance had remained. The corridor was narrow enough that they had to stop or collide. For a moment, Nobody spoke. Behind them, a production assistant was trying to get through with a camera case. Someone was shouting about a microphone problem. The chaos of Live Aid swirled around them, but in that small space, it was just two men who'd created magic together and paid a price for it. Bowie spoke first. "Good luck out there." Freddie nodded. "You were brilliant. Heroes was perfect for this." They could have left it at that. Professional courtesy between professionals. In 30 seconds, Freddie would continue to the stage, and that would be it. But something made Bowie step forward. Maybe it was the emotion still lingering from his own performance. Maybe it was something he'd sensed earlier in the day, watching Freddie move through the backstage area with that particular intensity. Maybe it was just instinct. The instinct of someone who'd been to the edge and recognized something in another person's eyes. Bowie closed the distance between them. He was taller than Freddie, and he leaned down slightly. His hand touched Freddie's shoulder, and then he spoke quietly. Just a few words that only Freddie could hear clearly. Brian May was 3 feet away, tuning his guitar, but he looked up at that moment. He saw Bowie's mouth move. He heard something. Not all of it, but enough. Freddie's face changed. The performance mask dropped for just a second. His eyes met Bowie's, and something passed between them, understanding, recognition, maybe fear. Then the mask came back, but different now. Harder, more determined. Bowie stepped back. Freddie nodded once, then turned and continued toward the stage. The entire encounter had lasted maybe 30 seconds. To anyone else watching, it was just two stars exchanging quick words before a performance. But Brian May stood frozen, his fingers still on the guitar strings, because he'd heard it. Not all of it, but enough. The words Bowie had whispered, "This is your Everest. Show them who you are." But there was something else. May wouldn't reveal the second part for decades, because the second part was darker, more personal, more prophetic. After "Show them who you are," Bowie had added something else, so quiet that May barely caught it. 3 more words that made Freddie's expression change so completely. "While you can." What happened next has been analyzed, dissected, and celebrated for nearly 40 years. Queen took the stage at 6:41 p.m. exactly, and for the next 20 minutes, Freddie Mercury delivered what many consider the greatest live rock performance in history. Bohemian Rhapsody, the recorded intro with Freddie emerging into the spotlight. Radio Gaga, 72,000 people clapping in perfect unison. Hammer to Fall, pure rock energy. Crazy Little Thing Called Love, Freddie prowling the stage with a guitar. We Will Rock You, the stadium becoming a single thundering heartbeat. And finally, We Are the Champions, an ending so perfect it felt inevitable. But it was more than just technical perfection. Freddie didn't just perform that day. He inhabited the stage like it was his natural element. Every gesture was precise yet spontaneous. Every note was controlled yet emotionally raw. He owned those 72,000 people, and through them, the 1.9 billion watching worldwide. He was commanding, vulnerable, powerful, human. He was everything a rock star could be, concentrated into 20 minutes. Brian May, playing the guitar parts he'd played thousands of times, found himself watching Freddie with a mixture of awe and heartbreak. Because he understood now what Bowie had seen, what Bowie had recognized. Freddie was performing like a man who knew time was precious, like someone grabbing immortality with both hands because he understood, perhaps unconsciously, that his time to grab it wouldn't last forever. After they finished and left the stage, the band was euphoric. They knew what they'd done. You could feel it in the air, see it in the eyes of other performers backstage who'd watched on monitors. Queen had stolen the day. But Freddie was quiet in the dressing room afterward, sitting with a towel around his neck, smoking a cigarette. When Roger Taylor asked if he was okay, Freddie just smiled and said he was tired. Brian May wanted to ask about Bowie, about what he'd said, but something stopped him. The moment felt too private, too raw. Later, when he'd remember back to that day, May would realize that Freddie had performed as if he were saying goodbye. Not to Queen, not to his bandmates, but to the world. Like he was leaving everything on that stage, making sure that if this was his last great moment, and somehow, some part of him knew it might be, it would be unforgettable. In the immediate aftermath of Live Aid, nobody talked about backstage whispers. The focus was on the triumph. Queen had reminded the world of their greatness, and Bowie had delivered a powerful, emotional heroes that fit the day perfectly. Reviews were ecstatic. Queen steals Live Aid, the headlines read. Freddie Mercury's performance became the gold standard, the thing every live performer would be measured against for decades. But for those who'd been there, who'd seen that moment in the corridor, it lingered. Brian May didn't speak about it, not even to the other band members. It felt like something private between Bowie and Freddie, and May respected that boundary. But he thought about it often, especially as the years passed and events unfolded that gave those whispered words new meaning. 1986. Queen released A Kind of Magic and toured Europe to massive crowds. Freddie seemed fine, energetic, still the consummate showman. But there were rumors starting in the industry, whispers about his health, about why he looked thinner, about why he was partying harder than ever, as if trying to pack multiple lifetimes into whatever time remained. 1987, Bowie released Never Let Me Down, an album he'd later call one of his worst mistakes, and embarked on the Glass Spider Tour, an overblown spectacle that felt more like theater than rock concert. Privately, he was struggling with his own demons again. Not drugs this time, but creative emptiness. He'd become a brand, a product, and it was suffocating him. He would soon form Tin Machine as an escape, a way to disappear back into the collective and rediscover why he made music in the first place. 1989. Freddie Mercury recorded what would be Queen's last album with him, The Miracle. During the sessions, he was increasingly ill, though he didn't tell the band the full truth yet. He just kept pushing, kept recording, kept giving them as much material as he could while he still had voice and strength. The album's title track had a lyric that would haunt listeners later. Every drop of rain that falls in Sahara Desert says it all. It's a miracle. 1991. On November 23rd, Freddie issued a public statement confirming he had AIDS. He died the next day, November 24th, at his home in Kensington. He was 45 years old. The world mourned. Brian May, along with Roger Taylor and John Deacon, were devastated. They'd known for months that the end was coming, but knowing doesn't prepare you for the reality. The day after Freddie's death, Brian May was going through old tour notebooks, something he did when he needed to feel connected to the past, to remind himself of the journey. He found his notes from Live Aid, scribbled reminders about set lists and timing. And there, in his own handwriting, was a note he'd written that day. Bowie told F something before we went on. F's face changed. He performed like a man possessed. What did B say? May sat with that notebook for a long time, remembering that corridor, that moment. Bowie's hand on Freddie's shoulder, the whispered words. Freddie's expression shifting. And then that extraordinary performance. 20 minutes of perfection that would define Queen's legacy. He thought about calling Bowie, asking him directly what he'd said. But something stopped him. It felt like breaking a confidence, violating something sacred. So he put the notebook away and kept the question to himself. David Bowie rarely spoke publicly about Freddie Mercury after his death. In interviews, when asked, he'd say appropriate things. Freddie was a brilliant performer, a unique talent, a force of nature. But he never went deeper. He never told stories about their time together, never revealed personal details. It was a level of discretion unusual even for Bowie, who'd spent a career carefully controlling his public image. In 1992, at the Freddie Mercury tribute concert at Wembley Stadium, Bowie performed Heroes and All the Young Dudes, with a lineup including Mick Ronson. He also recited the Lord's Prayer, which struck many as odd coming from Bowie, who'd never been particularly religious. But those who knew him understood it was his way of honoring something he couldn't speak about directly. The performance was powerful, emotional, and when he finished, you could see tears in his eyes. Afterward, backstage, Brian May thanked him for participating. They talked briefly about Freddie, about the disease that had taken him, about the ongoing AIDS crisis that was still killing thousands. Bowie was quiet, contemplative. May wanted to ask about Live Aid, about that moment 7 years earlier, but again, something held him back. Maybe it was still too soon. Maybe it was fear of the answer. The years continued. Bowie went through his own wilderness period with Tin Machine, then found himself again in the mid-90s with the Outside album and the collaboration with Brian Eno that reconnected him to his experimental roots. He aged, matured, became almost elder statesman-like. He married Iman and found real happiness, the kind that had eluded him for most of his life. He became a father again, to daughter Alexandria, and found joy in domesticity that his younger self would have mocked. But people close to Bowie noticed something. Every year on July 13th, the anniversary of Live Aid, he'd be quieter than usual, more introspective. And every year on November 24th, the anniversary of Freddie's death, the same thing. Iman learned not to schedule anything important on those days. It was like Bowie was observing his own private memorial, something he couldn't explain but needed to honor. In 2006, Bowie gave what would be his last major interview with Performing Songwriter magazine. The interviewer asked him about great performances he'd witnessed, and Bowie mentioned Queen at Live Aid without prompting. Freddie was extraordinary that day, he said. He knew how to seize a moment. He understood that sometimes you get one chance to show the world everything you are, and you have to take it. The interviewer asked if he'd spoken to Freddie that day. Bowie paused, then said, briefly, just some encouragement before he went on. That was all. But the pause before he answered was long, weighted with something the interviewer could sense but couldn't name. The interview moved on to other topics, but later, listening back to the recording, the interviewer would note that Bowie's voice had changed when talking about that moment, becoming softer, more careful, as if he were stepping around something too fragile to disturb. For nearly 4 decades, Brian May kept the secret. He'd written about Live Aid in his autobiography, detailed Queen's preparation and performance, but never mentioned the backstage encounter with Bowie. It was a deliberate omission, a blank space in the story that careful readers might notice but couldn't fill in. But in 2024, something changed. Perhaps it was reaching his own late 70s and feeling mortality's presence. Perhaps it was seeing how Live Aid had become mythologized, sanitized, reduced to highlight reels that missed the human moments. Perhaps it was simply time. Whatever the reason, when a journalist from Rolling Stone asked him about Bowie during an interview for the 40th anniversary of the Works album, May decided to speak. "Can I tell you something I've never told anyone publicly?" May asked. The journalist, sensing this was important, immediately said yes and kept the recorder running. May took a breath. At Live Aid, right before we went on stage, Bowie pulled Freddie aside. I was standing close enough to hear some of it. Not all, but some. He described the corridor, the moment, the expression on Freddie's face. He recounted Bowie's words. "This is your Everest. Show them who you are." Then he paused, and his voice became quieter. But there was something else. 3 more words I barely heard. "While you can." The journalist asked what May thought Bowie meant. May was quiet for a long moment. "I think Bowie saw something. He'd been through his own darkness. The cocaine years, the identity crisis, coming back from the edge. He knew what it looked like when someone was fighting something. And Freddie was fighting. Not consciously, maybe, not even admittedly. But Bowie recognized it. The urgency. The sense that time was more precious than anyone realized." May continued. "For years I wondered if Bowie knew something specific. Did he know about the AIDS rumors that were already starting? Did he sense Freddie was sick? But I don't think it was that direct. I think he just recognized a fellow warrior, someone who was grabbing at greatness with a kind of desperation that comes from knowing, on some level, that opportunities don't last forever." The interview went on for another hour, covering other topics, but that revelation was the headline. Brian May reveals Bowie's prophetic words to Freddie Mercury before historic Live Aid performance. The story spread quickly through social media, music forums, news outlets. People who'd been at Live Aid or watched it on TV felt like they were learning the secret ingredient to the magic they'd witnessed. But the public response was mixed. Some felt it added beautiful context to an already legendary performance. Others thought May was reading too much into a simple encouragement. Still others felt uncomfortable with the implication that Bowie had somehow foreseen Freddie's fate. The debate raged online, with everyone having an opinion about words whispered 40 years ago. Here's what we know for certain. David Bowie performed Heroes at Live Aid on July 13, 1985. Freddie Mercury and Queen delivered a 20-minute set immediately after that, has been called the greatest live rock performance ever. Bowie and Freddie had a complicated relationship forged in the intense, under-pressure recording sessions. Freddie Mercury died of AIDS-related complications in 1991. Brian May was present backstage at Live Aid and witnessed interactions between Bowie and Freddie. Here's what we don't know for certain. Exactly what Bowie whispered to Freddie, whether it was as prophetic as May's memory suggests, what Freddie thought about those words, whether it actually affected his performance, or if he would have delivered that same magic regardless. Memory is unreliable, especially memory filtered through 40 years and the tragedy of Freddie's death. It's possible Brian May's recollection has been colored by hindsight, by knowing how the story ended. It's possible he heard words that weren't exactly spoken, or didn't hear words that were. It's possible Bowie's encouragement was simpler than the weight May has given it. But it's also possible, probable even, that something real happened in that corridor. Two artists who'd created something powerful together, who'd fought and respected each other, connecting for a moment before one of them stepped into history. Bowie, who'd survived his own near destruction, recognizing something in Freddie's eyes and offering words that acknowledged the urgency, the importance, the fleeting nature of the moment. What makes May's account compelling isn't just the words themselves, but the context around them. Freddie's intensity in the months leading up to Live Aid. His performance that day, which even he acknowledged later was different, more focused, more powerful than usual. The way he approached recording in subsequent years, as if racing against a clock only he could hear. The way Bowie remained silent about their relationship, protecting something private even after death. And there's another piece of evidence, small but significant. In 1995, Queen released Made in Heaven, a posthumous album using Freddie's final vocal recordings. One track, A Winter's Tale, featured lyrics Freddie wrote about Montreux, Switzerland, where he spent his final months. There's a line that's haunted listeners since. Through the window I can see the clear moon and the high sea, and I can feel the stormy waves reaching out. Brian May has said that when he was working on those final tracks, arranging Freddie's last vocals, he kept thinking about Live Aid, about performance and legacy, about how artists leave pieces of themselves in every recording, every show, about how Freddie had been leaving pieces of himself for years, knowing somehow that he needed to give everything while he could. And about Bowie's words, which May had never shared but had carried, while you can. There's one more chapter to this story, and it's perhaps the most important one. In January 2016, David Bowie released Black Star, an experimental, challenging album that confused many fans expecting something more accessible. The music was jazzy, fragmented, dark. The lyrics were oblique, full of references to death and transcendence and mystery. The videos were unsettling, featuring Bowie with buttons sewn over his eyes, surrounded by occult imagery. 2 days after the album's release, on January 10th, Bowie's 69th birthday, he died. Cancer. The diagnosis had come 18 months earlier, and he'd told almost no one. While dying, he'd created one final masterpiece, a farewell gift wrapped in riddles and shadow. The parallels to Freddie weren't lost on anyone. Both men, faced with terminal illness, had chosen to keep working, to pour their remaining energy into art rather than into prolonging their decline. Both had created their most challenging personal work at the end. Both had controlled their narrative, revealing the truth only when they chose to, on their terms. Brian May was asked about Bowie's death in an interview shortly after. Did he see connections to Freddie's passing? May nodded slowly. David understood something that I think he learned partly from watching Freddie, that you can choose how to leave. That art can be a way of saying goodbye without surrendering to the disease, without letting it define you. Freddie worked until he literally couldn't stand. David did the same. They both refused to go quietly. May paused, then added something unexpected. I think about that moment at Live Aid differently now. What Bowie whispered to Freddie wasn't prophecy. It was recognition. David had faced his own mortality during the cocaine years, had come close to disappearing entirely. He knew what it meant to feel time running out, to feel the urgency to create while you still can. When he told Freddie, while you can, he wasn't predicting Freddie's death. He was speaking from experience about something every artist feels but doesn't always acknowledge, that we're all performing while we can. All of us. Every performance, every recording, every moment of creation is borrowed time that we're using to leave something behind. That interview gave new context to May's earlier revelation. It wasn't about Bowie having mystical knowledge of Freddie's fate. It was about two artists who understood the existential urgency of their work, who knew that greatness requires recognizing each moment's importance while you're in it. not in retrospect. So what really happened in that corridor at Wembley Stadium on July 13th, 1985? Two men spoke briefly. One offered encouragement to the other before a performance. Words were exchanged that perhaps fewer than a dozen people heard clearly. And then one of them walked onto a stage and delivered 20 minutes that would echo for decades. The content of those words, whether Brian May's memory is exactly accurate or colored by time and loss, matters less than what they represent. That brief encounter symbolizes something larger about art and mortality, about how we recognize in others our own struggles and triumphs, about how a moment of understanding between peers can carry weight beyond its duration. Freddie Mercury didn't need Bowie's words to be brilliant at Live Aid. He was always brilliant. But perhaps those words gave him permission to let go completely, to hold nothing back, to treat those 20 minutes as if they were everything. And perhaps, in doing so, Freddie taught Bowie something that he'd carry forward to his own ending 31 years later, that the way you leave matters, that art can be both legacy and goodbye, that you can choose to burn bright until the very end rather than fade slowly into darkness. Brian May released one more detail in a follow-up interview in late 2024. After Bowie died and May learned about Black Star, about how Bowie had hidden his illness and worked until the end, he went back and listened to Under Pressure for the first time in years. That collaboration that had been so difficult, so tense, and he heard something new in the lyrics, in the way Bowie and Freddie's voices intertwined, competing and harmonizing. This is our last dance. This is ourselves under pressure. They were both singing about the same thing, even back in 1981, May said. The pressure of creation, of time, of expectation, of trying to leave something meaningful before it's too late. They understood each other perfectly, even when they were fighting for control in the studio. And at Live Aid, Bowie reminded Freddie of that shared understanding. Not, "You're going to die soon," but "We're all racing against time, so make this count." And Freddie did. God, how he did. The story of what Bowie whispered to Freddie Mercury has now entered rock mythology, taking its place alongside the other legends and half-truths that surround both artists. Some will believe every word, others will dismiss it as nostalgic embellishment. But the truth is somewhere in between, a genuine moment of connection between two extraordinary artists, given deeper meaning by time and tragedy, but no less real for that additional weight. If you were watching Live Aid that day in 1985, you witnessed something historic. Now you know there was another layer to that history, a private moment that fed into the public triumph. Two men in a corridor, words spoken quietly, and then one of them walked onto a stage and showed the world everything he was while he could.